The visual is not important here. The music is not important here. The voice is not important here. What matters are the words. If you cannot listen to the words, you do not belong here. If you understand this, welcome to the Fate Club. There comes a moment when reaction stops being automatic, not because discipline was learned or control was strengthened, but because the internal mechanism that once translated every external impulse into immediate movement begins to lose urgency. At first it appears as a delay so small it can be ignored, a fraction of time where nothing happens, where the familiar surge of emotion, defense, explanation, or justification simply does not arrive on schedule. This delay is often misunderstood as tiredness or disinterest, yet it carries a different signature. Because the body remains present, perception remains sharp, but the need to answer dissolves quietly. The nervous system, long conditioned to respond as if every signal were a threat or a demand, starts to behave differently, not through conscious retraining, but through adaptation to an environment where constant reaction no longer produces meaningful outcomes. The organism begins to conserve energy by withholding responses that once seemed necessary, realizing without language that many stimuli no longer alter survival, identity, or position in the world. What once triggered immediate alignment or opposition now passes through awareness like weather noticed but not absorbed, registered but not owned. This shift does not announce itself dramatically, because it is not a breakthrough and not a revelation, but a gradual recalibration of internal priorities. Old reflexes still fire at times, yet they feel delayed, slightly misaligned, as if they belong to a previous version of reality that no longer fully exists. The body may still tense, the mind may still prepare narratives, but the follow-through weakens, and reaction fades before it completes its cycle. In earlier states, reaction functioned as a form of orientation, a way to locate oneself within systems of approval, threat, comparison, and control. To react was to confirm relevance, to prove presence, to maintain position within visible structures of meaning. When reaction becomes optional, this orientation collapses, leaving a strange neutrality where identity once anchored itself to response. This neutrality can feel unsettling because it removes the familiar feedback loop that confirmed existence through engagement. Without reaction, there is no immediate proof of alignment or resistance, no signal sent outward to define boundaries. Yet what replaces it is not emptiness, but a quieter form of coherence, where presence no longer depends on performance. The nervous system begins to operate with less noise, not because the world has become gentler, but because fewer signals are interpreted as requiring action. Conflict still appears, information still arrives, pressure still exists, but the internal translation changes. Instead of converting stimuli into emotion and emotion into action, the system pauses, allowing perception without compulsion. This pause is not learned through technique, because technique implies intention, and intention still belongs to the reactive loop. It emerges naturally when repeated engagement no longer produces clarity, relief, or resolution. Over time, the organism recognizes patterns where reaction only deepened exhaustion, confusion, or fragmentation, and it quietly withdraws its participation. As reaction loosens, time itself begins to feel different, stretching subtly around moments that once demanded immediacy. What used to feel urgent now feels optional, and what once required instant interpretation now waits without pressure. This change is not philosophical, but physiological, reflected in slower breathing, longer pauses between thoughts, and reduced internal commentary. The identity built around being responsive, decisive, emotionally available, or constantly opinionated begins to thin. Roles that relied on immediate engagement lose their grip because the energy that sustained them is no longer supplied automatically. This is often misread as apathy, but apathy implies disengagement, while this state implies selective presence. Presence remains, but it is no longer pulled outward by every signal. Awareness stabilizes internally, observing without the need to intervene, correct, or explain. This observation does not judge reaction as wrong, but simply does not require it to function. The moment reaction becomes optional is also the moment when control quietly loses relevance. Control depended on rapid response, on managing outcomes through constant adjustment and correction. Without the compulsion to react, control has nothing to attach itself to, and it dissolves without resistance. This dissolution does not create chaos, because chaos was sustained by constant interference. In the absence of reaction, systems either stabilize on their own or reveal their instability without obstruction. The organism learns to trust processes that unfold without intervention, recognizing patterns that persist regardless of response. Emotion also changes shape in this state, becoming less explosive and more diffuse. Feelings still arise, but they move through the body without demanding expression or resolution. They are experienced as signals, not commands, passing through awareness without defining behavior. This does not eliminate pain, frustration, or disappointment, but it removes their authority. Without the obligation to act on emotion, suffering loses its momentum. It is felt fully, then allowed to move on, unreinforced by narrative or reaction. Social interactions begin to shift as well, because many exchanges were sustained by predictable reactions. When reaction becomes optional, some dynamics weaken, others dissolve, and a few reconfigure into quieter forms of connection. Silence becomes more present, not as absence, but as space where nothing needs to be proven. Authority loses its sharpness in this state because authority relied on eliciting response. Commands, expectations, and judgments lose potency when they no longer trigger automatic compliance or defense. They are heard, understood, and then left without reinforcement. This does not produce rebellion or submission, but neutral clarity where instruction and pressure are evaluated rather than absorbed. The individual no longer defines themselves through opposition or agreement, but through internal alignment that does not require display. What remains is a form of autonomy that does not announce itself. As reaction fades, the boundary between inner and outer experience becomes less rigid. External events are perceived without immediately being internalized as identity threats or confirmations. The self becomes less porous to noise while remaining sensitive to what genuinely matters. This sensitivity is quieter than reactivity because it does not demand response to confirm awareness. It allows perception to deepen without turning it into action. In this state, understanding often arrives without explanation, and clarity appears without decision. The moment reaction becomes optional is not a destination, but a threshold. Beyond it, life continues with the same complexity, but with fewer internal collisions. Energy once spent on constant response becomes available for observation, integration, and rest. Nothing external confirms this shift because it does not seek validation. It often goes unnoticed by others, precisely because it does not express itself through visible change. Yet internally it marks the end of a certain kind of struggle, one that required constant participation to exist. What replaces reaction is not passivity, but discernment that operates without urgency. Action still occurs when necessary, but it emerges from clarity rather than compulsion. Movement happens, but it is not driven by fear, comparison, or the need to be seen. This state does not elevate or diminish the individual. It simply reflects an organism that no longer needs to respond to everything to remain intact. The world continues to signal, but the internal system listens selectively, conserving coherence. In this quiet recalibration, reaction becomes a choice rather than a reflex. And in that choice, something fundamental shifts, not outwardly, but in the way reality is processed. What once demanded immediate response now waits, and often dissolves without consequence. If you understand this, welcome to the club.